I don't know if anybody's here. Oh, two people, I think. Be right there, guys. Let me put a little ice in my cup here. I was just mopping up from the dogs in the family room. And I'm spilling this. We have those puppy pads down by the dog door. And sometimes they miss a little bit. Peanut does because she's old. So I just had to mop that up and put some fresh ones there. I hope Big Mama shows up. I felt bad because she wanted stories the other night and I didn't do them. Because I was so tired. I was sleepy. Hi, Mo. Hi, Steph. Billy Jones. We got 6 people here tonight. We rolling. Okay. What do you guys want? Do you want scary? Or do you want to go with some reminisce? Hi, little lady. Nice to see you. Hi, Annie B. Hi, Firm Wife. And yes, Carolyn knows I'm live. I sent her a message. We were on the phone as well. Of course, I don't think I told her on the phone because I wasn't sure if I was gonna. But I did send her a message. I sent Davita, and here's Davita. I sent Moo, and there's Moo. What do you guys want? Scary or the reminisce? The reminisce is just a special that they sent out. It's not the actual magazine. It's the extra that they send for subscribers. Okay, how about we do a couple out of these and then we'll do a couple of the scary ones. How about that? How about that? Wouldn't be bad, right? Okay. Because I am kind of into these dumb, scary stories right now. But it's for you guys, so we can all do something together. Hi, Lisa Thomas. Thank you. Thank you, Davita. Yes, I didn't start my diet yet. I am going to, though, I promise. Hi, Kathy. I promise. But I'm not sure about getting on a scale in front of you guys. Kind of rethinking that one. Okay. This is reminisce stories that shaped our lives. Zippo lighters, Mardi Gras in the 50s, fabulous Formica, mid-century style, a home of our own. Isn't that a nice home, though? Just no special diet, Davita. Just move around and eat right, and it'll come off. Got to change my ways. Be healthy. Here's Army Engineer Daniel Holden of Auburn, New York. He bought a special Zippo to remind him of his work on Lajwa in the Marshall Islands in the 1970s. Daniel's is the first story in our Zippo lighter, which starts on page 26. Big Mama, I felt so guilty since that one night. I really did, really have. Our contents here. Somebody actually wanted me, and I blew it off because I was tired. This is the editor's note at Papa Jack's table. We all carry pieces of history, and I don't mean only our cherished memories. For many of us, the past is tangible and large. Mark and I have several pieces of furniture that we inherited from his grandparents, Papa Jack and Florence. A blonde wood bed with built-in bookshelves and a Formica kitchen table are among my favorites. Okay, good little lady, because this is for you. It's for you and Davida and Kathy and Lisa Thomas and Farm Wife and Steph and Moo and Annie B and Billy Jones and anybody else that might happen to listen. And hello to all the people watching in the replay like YouTube says to do when you're making a video. I did read everything and I'm trying to do it like they want. Hello. Thank you for coming. Please relax and enjoy the stories. I'm so glad you're here. Hi, help me, Rhonda. That table is now my home desk. Papa Jack and Florence bought it and other pieces when they were fixing up their new tract home in Utica, New York in the 1940s. Hi, LMNW50. As thousands of other young families were doing at the time. In our cover feature, How We Live Now, page 32, we look at the decor of the post-war period. Okay, Annie, which marked a bold departure then and is still admired today. It was an era when middle-class homeowners could enjoy craftsmanship and beautiful design at an affordable price. Broyhill's Brasilia line is an example. Echoing artistic flourishes, architect Oscar Niemeyer devised in 1960 for Brazil's new Capitol buildings. Broyhill's sturdy walnut and pecan furniture features dramatic swoops. The line was so popular it inspired a set of dollhouse furniture. Brasilia is highly collectible now, going for prices that would make dear Papa Jack blanch. Hi, Jenny D1. So if you have some Brasilia or any other original modernistic furniture from that period, we hope our story helps you to see it with fresh eyes and treasure it. Here is what Broyhill Brasilia was patented in the early 1960s. The line is an example of the affordable luxury middle-class buyers enjoyed at mid-century. Today's collectors also look for rare dollhouse pieces in the Brasilia style. Oh, and you guys could submit a story and maybe we'll read about it. No, this isn't about haunted furniture. Steph, you can send in your true tales are the heart of this magazine. So dust off that photo album, high school yearbook, or vacation diary. They want you to label your story and photos in the kitchen, quote unquote. So, a future made in the USA feature will focus on makers of kitchen products, Lodge cast iron, KitchenAid mixers, and Regalware pots and pans. Share your favorite connections with these mealtime helpers. And they have other departments. They say if you still can't figure it out or you want to send a story, who was it that told me they were sending a story? They were writing it up. Somebody told me that. And they were sending it in. They have these just different departments. It says you still can't decide where your story belongs. Send it along and let us figure it out. They have growing up, the joys of childhood and teenage years, pictures from the past, how we lived and looked back when. Is it a fantastic picture? Send it for consideration for our back cover. True love from first dates to last dances. At work, jobs that earned a place in your memory. Brush with fame, the thrill of meeting someone famous. And keepsakes, stories behind treasured items passed down or kept for years. Yes, I'm going to do hauntings in a minute. Just let me read a couple of these and we're gonna do the hauntings. I know you guys like them. I do too. I got the place marked. We're going to go to it. Just hang on. A couple of people just wanted to hear one of these old stories for a minute. I know it seems like these spooky ones are really popular. Let me see. I'm just going to skip through, find one. Let's go to that guy that's going to talk about his Zippo lighter. How about that? Every Zippo tells a story. 3 lighters define different stages in this sailor's life. From Dwayne Klein, Hartford, Wisconsin. Okay, you want spooky? We'll come back to you. Your story is very important to us, Dwayne Klein. Everybody's in the mood for something spooky right now, so we'll come back. You guys will be here. We don't want to rush through your story. Lexi, what is that? Huh? The TV. I know it's the TV, but it sounds really weird. Thank you. Lisa H, are you here? Steph, I think it is. A lot of them got sick of so many of the Reminisce stories, so they wanted something different for a little while, you know? Fireball, Huntington County. It was midwinter 1905, and Muriel and I were walking home from school, swinging our lunch pails and discussing the mathematics homework our teacher had set for us that afternoon. The snow drifted deeply on either side. though the lane itself was a clear, icy space with the occasional rut where horses' hooves or a sleigh runner had dug in too deeply. I just don't understand the word problems, Muriel complained. They're too complicated, and we have a test on Monday. I know I'll fail. Right, LMNW? You won't fail, I assured her, brushing a strand of dark hair off my face. My curly hair was always escaping its braid. It drove me wild. I'll come over tomorrow and help you study. Muriel's face lit up. Will you, Anne? She cried. Thanks. I smiled at her. She was one of my nicest neighbors and a good friend. She helped me piece a quilt last summer when Mama had assigned me the chore. I loathed sewing, and I'd much appreciated Muriel's quick fingers and cheerful chatter. It made the quilting bearable. I felt I owed her something for all the trouble she'd taken with the quilt last summer, and here was my chance to repay her. We had reached Muriel's house by this time. Muriel paused beside the gate to bid me farewell and then stiffened. Anne, look, she gasped, pointing behind her house. I followed the line of her finger and saw a huge ball of fire whirring frantically away from the back door, heading toward the woods. As it reached the edge of her property, it suddenly vanished. What was that? Gasped Muriel, her face going pale. I don't know, I replied shakily, clutching the fence rail with my trembling hand and forcing my wobbly knees to hold me upright. My stomach lurched as I replayed the scene in my mind. I'd heard, at least I thought I heard, a child screaming from the center of the giant fireball. That couldn't be right. Of course not. Perhaps we imagined it, I said, trying to reassure myself as much as Muriel. Muriel's face darkened with sudden conviction. It was an omen. Hi, Joyce Miller. Thank you for coming. Hi, Jenny D1. I don't know if I said hi or not. It was an omen, she said. Something terrible is going to happen. Don't be silly, I said, in a voice that trembled too much to reassure. I must tell Mother, Muriel said. I'll see you tomorrow, Anne. She rushed down the shoveled path and fled into the house. I wasn't quite sure what she thought her mother could do about the strange fireball we'd seen. Her mother had been very ill ever since the new baby had been born 10 days ago. She could barely sit up in a chair for more than a half hour at a time before retreating to her bed. She could not be expected to investigate disappearing fireballs. I walked home slowly, my gut shaken by the strange experience, but I forgot all about it when a snowball crashed into my shoulder as I turned into my driveway. My elder brother grinned at me from the front lawn, tossing another snowball up and down in his gloved hands. I dropped my books immediately and armed myself, all thoughts of disappearing fireballs forgotten in my hasty preparation for a snow war. I finished my chores early the next morning, and Mama gave me permission to walk to Muriel's house to study. I whistled cheerfully as I slipped and slid down the icy lane, swinging my satchel full of school books. I slowed as I neared Muriel's house, watching for mysteriously vanishing fireballs. But the only burning object I saw was the sun way up in the sky. Oh no, my mistake. There was a fire near the pig pen. As I drew closer, I could see that it was Muriel's father boiling up some potatoes in a large kettle hanging over an open fire, making swill for the pigs. He smiled and waved when he saw me. Good morning, Anne, he said pleasantly. Muriel's in the house helping her ma. Thank you, Mr. Myers, I said with an answering smile. I entered the house to find things in a state of mild chaos. The baby was screaming. Mrs. Myers was lying down with a sick headache, and little Tony had just knocked over the butter churn, spilling curds everywhere. I scooped up the sobbing 2-year-old and held him on my lap while Muriel cleaned up the mess. The other children, 4 and 6 years old respectively, peered down at us from the loft, where Muriel had banished them for shouting and giving their mama a sore head. Oh, let's see. Where's the bot? Oh, yeah, I see it. Thanks, Steph. Mr. Myers poked his head in at this juncture and called to Muriel, I am going out to the clearing to harvest those trees I marked the other day. I reckon they will make enough lumber to build the addition to the house come spring. Keep the children away from the pig swill pot. Muriel nodded a distracted acknowledgement from her place on the floor. She was still mopping up the spilled milk as Mr. Meyer kissed his ailing wife and departed. I put the squirming Tony down on the bed beside his baby brother and his mother, and then I went to fix Mrs. Myers some willow bark tea, which was good for headaches. Within 15 minutes, the house was serene again. The older children were allowed downstairs to play in the sitting room with Tony, while Muriel and I did mathematics problems around the kitchen table. The tea revived Mrs. Myers so much that she got up and started kneading the dough Muriel had set to rise very early that morning. It was quarter to 11 when Mrs. Myers exclaimed, Why, Joseph has forgotten his lunch. Muriel and I both looked up from our books and saw the lunch pail on the sideboard. I know, right, little Miss STF? I'll take it to him, Mama, said Muriel, standing up and stretching out the kinks. At that moment, there came a thud and then a boy's angry roar from the sitting room. The children were quarreling. Mrs. Myers sighed and said, Please go sort that out, Muriel. Anne can take the lunch to your papa. Muriel made a face, but went obediently into the front room to scold her siblings into good behavior. I donned my coat and snow boots, got directions to the clearing from Mrs. Myers, and headed out the back door into the snow. Let me get my rest here, my Kleenex box. Here's the illustration. See the fireball? The potatoes were boiling nicely in the big black kettle that hung over the open fire beside the pig pen. It smelled rather tasty, though I knew the swill was good only for pigs. I tramped past the pig pen and the fire, feeling the warmth of the blaze from several feet away. Then I followed Mr. Meyer's footprints through the snow, through the woods, up and over a small ridge, and then down into a clearing near the stream. Mr. Myers looked up when I entered the clearing. He was chopping a newly fallen tree into easy-to-haul pieces, a heavy job, and greeted the sight of the lunch pail with a smile. Spooky. Bless Emily for remembering. That will save me a half hour, he said. He thanked me, too, and asked me to set the lunch pail down on the new stump. I tromped back up the ridge and down the other side, enjoying the lovely cold day. It was hard work walking in deep snow, but the mix of sun and tree shadows on the snow made lovely lacy pictures, and sparkles from the ice crystals danced here and there. All too soon, I reached the edge of the woods, stepped out into the backyard, and saw a fireball hurling toward me across the snow. I gasped in alarm and ducked. Then I realized it wasn't a fireball. It was a small child, clothes ablaze, racing through the snow toward me, as if they were trying to outrun the flames that enveloped him from shoe to collar. Oh, God. Why are these so horrible? And these are all local lore guys from Indiana. This one's from Huntington, Indiana. He was screaming in agony. As soon as my mind registered what I was seeing, I screamed too. I was 20 yards away from little Tony, and I ran as fast as I could toward the burning child. Lay down, I shouted desperately to the 2-year-old. Lay down and roll. The back door burst open as I shouted. Muriel and her mother came rushing out to see what the noise was about. They'd been busy treating a bloody scrape the 6-year-old had received during the tussle in the front room and hadn't even noticed Tony had gone outside. Their screams mingled with little Tony's wail as they took in the situation and ran toward the blazing toddler. The 3 of us reached the toddler at the same time, thrusting him down into the snow and rolling him around, frantically trying to douse the flames. Tony's screams turned to a tiny sobbing moan that died away with the flames. His body was burnt black with raw red patches where his clothes had protected him a mite. Only his shoes and the collar of his shirt remained. Sobbing, Mrs. Myers attempted to lift Tony up, but she was still weak from her recent childbirth and fell on her knees, his little burnt body clutched to her chest. With a shout from the edge of the woods, Mr. Myers raced towards us, his eyes wide with fear. I heard screams. What's wrong? He cried. Then he saw the little unmoving body in his wife's arms. Tony was still breathing, but barely. Mr. Myers picked up the burnt child with one large hand and cradled him against his broad shoulder. With his other hand, little lady, it says tales of hauntings, strange happenings, and other local lore. So they're tales. So some things in here started out from something true and then kind of built. I don't know though, little lady. I don't know. It's horrible though. Seems like each story seems to get worse and worse. Then he saw the little unmoving body in his wife's arms. Tony was still breathing, but barely. Mr. Myers picked up the burnt child with one large hand and cradled him against his broad shoulder. With his other hand, he helped his wife up. While Muriel ran for the doctor, I raced into the house to prepare every home remedy I had learned of to treat Tony's burns. It was already too late, I knew, somewhere deep in my mind. But we had to try. All of us had to try. Little Tony died an hour later, shortly after the doctor arrived. Mrs. Myers fell into her husband's arms, weeping desperately. Muriel rushed out the back door, and I followed, feeling terrible. If only I hadn't lingered in the woods. If only I had hurried right back after giving Mr. Myers his lunch. If only Mama said those were the 2 saddest words in the whole world. Now I knew what she meant. Muriel turned a tear-streaked face to me and pointed towards the edge of the house. The fireball, she whispered. The fireball. I followed the line of her finger, suddenly realizing that little Tony, in his death throes, had run along the path taken by the vanishing fireball we'd seen yesterday. The fireball had been an omen foretelling his death by fire. Swallowing in horror, I stared back at my friend. Was there something we could have done? I asked her. I waited for her answer, throat going dry with dread. The answer came not from Muriel, who was weeping again, but from Mr. Myers, who stood in the doorway. His dark eyes were wet with grief. There was nothing you could do, child. Nothing any of us could do, he said firmly. It was an accident. Tony didn't listen to his mama or Muriel when they told him to stay in the house. He slipped outside while they were fixing up little Hannah's knee. It wasn't anyone's fault. I nodded and put my arm around the weeping Muriel, and Mr. Myers went back into the house. I thought about the fireball as I comforted my friend. What was the use of a death omen when you didn't know what it meant until it was too late? Were these tragedies inevitable? Could they be turned aside somehow if the family understood the warning? I didn't know the answers to my questions, but I swore at that moment that I would discover the truth. If death omens could be used to prevent tragedies instead of just foreshadowing them, then I owed it to Tony and to myself to find out. With that decided, I urged my weeping friend to come into the house and drink some tea. Dang. Okay, we read this one about Evansville because Kevin had wanted us to, so we did read that. That's about that loup-garou, the wolf. I don't think we read this one. Three Fawns, this one's called, from Shelby County, Indiana. In July of 1850, shortly after my wife died, I moved into town with my young daughter, Matilda. At the time, there were plenty of stories circulating about three witches who had recently built a log cabin in the woods just outside town. I didn't believe in witches or fairies or any kind of supernatural gobbledygook. It was superstitious nonsense, and I didn't want my little girl exposed to those sort of tales. I bought a small house next door to the home of Widow Donner, who had twins, a boy and a girl, just a year older than Matilda. All three children played together during the long summer days and walked to school together in the fall. I admired Widow Donner, a plain, dark-haired, sensible woman who had shouldered the responsibilities of her dead husband's mercantile after he'd passed and was doing a fine job of raising her two children. She kept an eye on Matilda when I went out hunting and trapping, and in exchange, I provided meat for her table several times a week. I spoke often with Widow Donner over the garden fence while I skinned the day's catch and she hoed her vegetables. We became quite good friends. Here's an illustration of the three fawns. Widow Donner knew how I felt about supernatural nonsense, so I was extremely put out the day Matilda came home from school and announced that our neighbor had claimed her cow had been hexed. Mrs. Donner said the cow was cursed by three witches, she said as she placed her lunch pail on the kitchen table, where I was carefully sharpening my hunting knives. Matilda, you know there's no such thing as witches, I said. But Pa, Widow Donner said, Matilda, I interrupted her sharply. You know I don't approve of supernatural talk. Yes, Pa, she said, closing her pink lips into a tight line of disapproval. We stared sharply at one another for a long moment until her mouth drooped in compliance. She sighed reluctantly and went out to do her chores. I put away my knives and stalked outside, fuming as I walked swiftly through the cow pasture and over to the outbuilding where I skinned deer and smoked meat. Widow Donner's garden lay on the far side of the fence, and sure enough, there she was, calmly hoeing. She wore a blue flowered sunbonnet that brought out the blue of her eyes, and the tendrils of her dark hair curled beside her rosy cheeks. She looked rather fetching, despite the sweat beading her forehead. I was too upset to care. "Mistress Donner, how dare you talk to Matilda about witches?" I shouted as I was in earshot. "You know I don't hold with that talk of the supernatural." Carrie Donner stood up straight and looked at me calmly with her intelligent blue eyes. "I did not speak to Matilda about witches. She overheard me instructing Daniel and Francine about the best way to care for our hexed cow." "Hexed cow? Ha! Sick cow, you mean?" I cried, infuriated by her calm tone. "Hexed cow," Carrie Donner said firmly. "She stopped giving milk overnight, and today she started chasing her tail like a dog. She got so dizzy, the twins had to tie her up to make her stop. Now she is banging her head repeatedly against the barn wall." I blinked in surprise over this description, and my mind whirled with all the possible diseases that could make a cow behave in such a manner. Milk fever, the staggers. I rattled off a whole list, and Carrie shook her head after each one. "Okay, Harry, explain to me why my cow is trying to talk," she said finally, cutting me off mid-list. "What?" I exclaimed in astonishment. "She's trying to talk." "Yes, thank you, Lisa. Thank you." "She's trying to talk," Carrie repeated. "Woman, you must be mad," I said flatly. "That's impossible." "See for yourself," she said, gesturing toward the garden gate. With a goaded glare, I stormed through the gate, past my irritating, if attractive, neighbor, and into the barnyard. By the time I reached the cow barn, I was trailed by all three children and the fetching widow Donner. As I stepped into the barn, I heard the lowing of a distressed cow, a very strange lowing. "Feed me, hungry," mooed the cow. The lowing was followed by the bang, bang, bang of her horned head against the back of her stall. My mouth dropped open, and then I hurried through the door and across the wooden floor to stare over the stall door at Daisy. She butted the back wall with her. "Feed me." We need Moo in here doing that. She butted the back wall with her brown and cream head, then turned to roll an eye at me over her shoulder. The twins had tied a rope around her neck and secured it to the walls on either side with two more ropes to prevent the cow from circling to death. But they were going to have to adjust the rope again to keep her from knocking herself silly on the back wall. "Hungry," Daisy bellowed when she saw me at the door. "Food." "That's impossible," I gasped as Daisy started banging her head again. Beside me, Francine slipped through the open door and went over to the hungry cow. "Help me, Daniel," she called to her brother, and together they pushed the cow away from the back wall and adjusted the rope halter to keep her from banging her head again. "Here's some hay, Daisy," my daughter chirped, dumping the hay into the manger. Francine had to loosen one of the restraining ropes so Daisy could reach. "Ank. Ooh," Daisy lowed through a mouthful. I turned shocked eyes toward Carrie. "What? How? I must be losing my mind." "You are seeing what we're all seeing," Carrie said. "She's been hexed. Come on, Pa. Matilda said kindly, taking my head. Taking my head. Mrs. Donner can fix you a cup of tea and will explain things to you. Still stunned by what I'd seen, I followed my daughter back to Widow Donner's house while the twins made sure Daisy was secured in her stall. Over a steaming cup of tea, Carrie Donner explained that she had refused to sell Daisy to the youngest of the McLean sisters who lived in the log cabin outside town. She's one of the witches, Matilda said excitedly, bouncing in her chair. Out of habit, I frowned at her and then blinked when I remembered what I'd just witnessed. I'm sure the McLean sisters can't be witches, I said belatedly. Okay, cat's got my tongue. Surely they could not be. All three sisters had lovely golden hair, creamy complexions, and demure ways. Half the men in town were in love with them. I myself had hankered after the middle McLean sister until the day she turned down my offer to carry her parcels out to the wagon when she was shopping in the Donner Mercantile. There were 6 of us fellows hanging around about the porch, hoping to squire the pretty woman to her wagon, and I got the choice position near the door. I was the first man to offer my assistance to the lady, but she refused my offer and chose the handsome blacksmith instead. After being publicly humiliated in such a fashion, I'd lost interest in the middle McLean sister and turned back to my hunting and trapping. I'd have to look elsewhere for a mother for Matilda. Francine and Daniel came banging into the house at that moment. Francine heard my remark about the McLean sisters and exchanged a meaningful glance with Matilda. Honestly, said Francine, men never believe a pretty woman can be a witch. I believe it, Daniel said mildly. The boy resembled his mother in looks and character. Frances, as golden as the McLean sisters, must take after her dead father. Carrie smothered a grin and poured her children hot tea. All 5 of us devoured the biscuits she'd baked while we discussed the hexed cow. So, I said, swallowing a buttery mouthful, how do we fix Daisy, assuming she can be fixed? Carrie smiled and rose from the table to pick up a couple of silver spoons from her drawer full of utensils. That's simple, she said, laying them beside me. I think you should go deer hunting, Harry, with these. The next day, she found me face down beneath a bush, the rain pouring all around me. I had my gun under me to keep it dry, which did not add to my comfort. A constant stream of water was dripping from the rim of my hat and running down my nose. I muttered curses at Carrie and her crazy ideas as I waited and waited and waited for 3 fawns to stroll by. Carrie insisted that the McLean sisters were shapeshifters who took on the form of a deer when they roamed the woods. I've seen them, she said. When I went to the McLean cabin to buy herbs, I saw 3 fawns racing through the underbrush. They ran up to the cabin and pushed through the door. As they entered the house, I saw them changing shape. I didn't want the sisters to know I'd seen them shapes shifting, so I waited 5 minutes before I walked up to the cabin and knocked. When the sisters answered, there were no signs of any fawns in the cabin. So there I lay under a soaking wet bush, holding a rifle full of silver bullets, waiting in the rain for 3 supposedly magic fawns. If I hadn't looked in on Daisy before I'd left, I would have thought I had imagined the whole thing. But Daisy was even worse today. Cross-eyed, heavy, and swollen with milk that refused to come out of her udder, and moaning in passable English, Hurt. Oh. There was so much swishing rain and swirling mist that I almost didn't see the first fawn as it stepped into the clearing. I was wringing out my saturated hat when a movement caught my eye. I froze in place and watched the fawn saunter a few feet into the rain-soaked grass and start munching. A moment later, two more fawns followed the first into the meadow. Any of the deer would make a decent meal and a nice spotted pelt to sell. I raised my gun and then hesitated. If they really were women, witches, whatever, I probably shouldn't kill them. I'd just wing one of them and see what happened. I aimed at the closest fawn and fired. The bullet winged the deer in the hind leg, just where I'd aimed. The fawns bolted, with the injured one limping at the rear. I followed them at a speed through the meadow, over the ridge, and along the stream. Sure enough, we were heading in the direction of the McLean cabin. 3 minutes brought me to the edge of the clearing in time to see the fawns racing through the front door and transforming into women as they stepped inside. The last woman, the youngest sister, stumbled on her injured leg as she transformed. The eldest sister caught her by the arm and helped her inside, while the middle sister shut the door. My face went tight and grim as I stepped into the clearing with my rifle of silver bullets. I could no longer deny the existence of witches. Carrie was right. I walked up to the door and pounded on it with the butt of my rifle. I heard whispering inside, and then the middle sister opened the door. "Why, Harry," she cooed when she saw me, fluttering her long blonde eyelashes. I glared at her, and her smile faded. I pushed inside the cabin and looked over at the bed in the corner where the youngest sister lay. The eldest McLean was pressing a blood-stained cloth over the injury. The sisters stared at me in fear as I stalked over to the bed. Turning abruptly to the middle sister, I said, "Take the spell off Daisy right now." I didn't raise my rifle. I didn't have to. She nodded and backed away from me. I motioned the eldest sister away from the bed and started giving orders. Hot water, clean cloths, a clean sharp knife. I tried a tourniquet above the wound to stop the bleeding, while the youngest sister moaned in pain. "Give her some whiskey to drink," I snapped to the middle sister as soon as she finished her mysterious chanting in the far corner of the room. She obeyed instantly. When the materials were ready and the youngest sister had drunk enough whiskey to relax and blot out some of the pain, I removed the silver bullet from her leg and then cleaned and bandaged the wound. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and somberly regarded the three beautiful sisters. "I'll give you 1 day to leave town," I said quietly. "If you leave now and remove any spells you've put on the townsfolk, I will not betray your secret. If you don't leave," I didn't finish the sentence. The sisters sighed almost in unison. "We will leave," said the eldest. "We will leave." Rising to my feet, I shouldered my rifle and walked to the door. "Thank you, Harry Belton," the youngest sister said. At the doorway, I paused for a moment and gave a tiny nod. Then I stepped outside and into the drizzle. As I walked away from the witch cabin, the sun came out, dazzling my eyes with sparkles. Just as I reached the edge, where was I? Just as I reached the edge of the path, the middle sister called through the window, "Harry, you should marry Widow Donner. She's the reason I refused your offer to carry my packages." I whirled around, but not in time. The window slammed shut before I could speak. The middle McLean sister waved happily at me and drew the curtains. Francine and Daniel ran to meet me when I entered the rain-washed farmyard. Matilda squealed from her place on top of the fence and jumped in my arms. Daisy's better, Pa, she cried. Did you kill the fawns? I didn't kill them, but I did persuade them to leave town, I said, raising my voice so Carrie Donner could hear me from the door of the house. Carrie smiled at me, her blue eyes blazing with the same strong emotion that was coursing through my blood. I smiled back and hurried to meet her. Francine took my hand, my free hand in hers, as we all walked in a cluster over to the farmhouse. I wondered in that moment if the McLean sisters had set me up for this moment. Had they truly put a curse on Daisy? Or had they just been matchmaking? Hi, Kathy Greenier. I'm glad you enjoy listening. What do you care, Fat Hannah? It's up to you. Why do you care what he got? None of your business. Bye, Fat Hannah. I wondered in that moment if the McLean sisters had set me up for this moment. Had they truly put a curse on Daisy, or had they just been matchmaking? I realized I didn't care, so long as I could persuade the widow Donner to marry me. A sudden movement by the fence caught my eye. A single spotted fawn stood watching us, ears alert, eyes warm. Then it leapt sideways and was gone. No, that one wasn't too bad. It wasn't gory. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to stop at about 1 hour, guys. It was kind of cute, right? A heart made wise. Thanks for coming. Jeanette, are you here? I hope you're listening. You said you were lurking here at the story time before. I hope you're here. This one's called Tom Morgan's Dream from Jeffersonville, Indiana. I can't say I was prepared for what I found in the woods that day. I was mending oyster boats down by the Port Fulton docks one morning, round about July of 1847. Yes, all these are pretty old, aren't they? When I found myself running a bit short of wood. Did you, LM? I kind of did too. So I trotted off into the nearby forest, looking for a tree or two I could lumberjack for spare parts. I hadn't gotten very far when I stumbled over a mound of newly turned dirt, poorly concealed by leaves and other detritus. As I righted myself, I realized that the tip of a shoe was sticking up out of the ground, with a foot still in it. Well, I didn't stick around in those woods, no, sir, not with a corpse in residence. I ran back to the docks to report the matter to the authorities. I led the police to the place where I'd stumbled over the body, and they excavated until they uncovered the corpse of a businessman with his skull bashed in. Mama, 2 men, thank you. I got your screenshots. I really appreciate it. Carolyn wanted to see him too. I read him to her tonight before he came on. Thank you. If that happens tonight, take a shot, okay? Screenshot. Again, you did great. The officers took the body away and put it on display at the market house, asking folks for help in identifying the poor man. It took a while, but finally a fellow who owned a boarding house over in Louisville. Hi, Meg Healy. Louisville. They say it different down there in Kentucky. We say Louisville. identified the man as one of his boarders who disappeared a few days before. Apparently, the murdered man, whose name was Foxworthy, had gone hunting with a bloke named Whittinghill from the same boarding house. In the morning, Whittinghill had left the boarding house with Foxworthy and a fancy hickory club he'd had custom made. In the evening, Whittinghill had returned to the boarding house without Foxworthy or the club. Whittinghill had spun a spurious story about Foxworthy suddenly deciding to take a job here in Jeffersonville. He had even produced a letter, supposedly from Foxworthy, instructing the landlord to turn over Foxworthy's trunk and other belongings to Whittinghill. The fellow running, "You're waiting for your brother to get here after the flood. Please keep me company." Well, yes, very, very much, until we're only going to be here a few more minutes. But yeah, I'm glad you're safe. And your brother, Meg. That's so scary. I saw some of the floods on the news. Let's see. The fellow running the boarding house was mighty suspicious of that letter. He didn't think the handwriting in the letter looked anything like Foxworthy's handwriting. He refused to turn over the trunk to Whittinghill, knowing it contained a large sum of money that Foxworthy had saved up over the years. Then Whittinghill did a runner, the owner of the boarding house told the police, disappeared without a trace. I knew something suspicious had happened. Poor Foxworthy. The police went on a manhunt and soon had Whittinghill in their custody, but the murder weapon was still missing, and without it, the police had no case. The authorities formed a search party to look for it, and I volunteered. I felt I had a vested interest in the case, having found poor Foxworthy in the woods. It was a frustrating search. There were too many nooks and crannies and too much undergrowth in the forest and not enough searchers. For a while, it looked like Whittinghill would get away with murder. Here's just an illustration of what he found in the woods, the body. Kevin, there you are. Great job today, Kevin. Then one morning I bumped into a bloke named Tom Morgan, who'd been in the search party, same as me, helping the police scour the woods around Jeffersonville for the murder weapon. Tom looked real pale and distressed. I asked what was wrong, and he told me that he'd had a strange dream in the middle of the night. In his dream, the ghost of Foxworthy had appeared and led him into the woods. They'd walked a long way until they reached a swampy area. There, Foxworthy's ghost showed Tom the custom-made hickory club hidden underneath a rotting log. I'm sure I'd know the place again if I saw it, Tom told me. It's a long shot, but I want to try to find it. Will you come with me? I agreed at once. I felt I owed it to poor Foxworthy. Invigorated by this possible clue, we went hunting for the place revealed by the ghost in Tom's dream. We scoured every swamp region within a couple miles of Jeffersonville. I was about to give up when Tom came running over a small ridge and waved to me, shouting, "This is it! I found the place!" I ran to join him, and he pointed down into a swampy nook with a rotten log lying near the water. "There's the log I saw in the dream," Tom said. Tom grabbed a long stick and poked it underneath the rotting log. It hit something hard. Carefully, he pushed the object until it rolled out from under the log. It was a custom-made hickory club, just like the one Tom had seen in his dream. I gasped and clasped a hand over my mouth when I saw it. It was still spattered with blood, brains, and hair from Foxworthy's head. Whittinghill was convicted of the murder of Foxworthy based upon the witness of the proprietor of the boarding house and the evidence Tom had found. Convicted murderer was given the death penalty, but he died a few months before it was carried out. Some say of remorse. So justice was done after all, thanks to Tom Morgan's dream. It's storming there, Kevin. It's raining here. It stormed a lot last night. It was windy and lots of lightning and thunder, rain. I love a good storm, though. Lexi loves the rain. I'll read Strange Case. How about that? Hi, Kay Bay. You're from Hopkinsville? Hopkinsville, Kentucky? Good, Meg, good. Heavy rain, Kevin? Okay, this one is called Strange Case out of South Bend, Indiana. I love storms, Lisa. Never been in a hurricane. I'd be terrified. It was by far the strangest case I'd ever dealt with during my 20 plus years as a physician serving the town of South Bend. It was 1880 and business was booming. What with all the births, deaths, cuts, scrapes, colds, fevers, and such that make up a daily medical practice. There was also the more tragic side of doctoring, including a partially sad case of tuberculosis that I'd handled recently. Young Sarah Platt had died of the disease a few months earlier, and I felt her loss keenly. I'd done everything medically possible to no avail. We had to find a cure for tuberculosis. It killed too many of our young people. Doctors see the tragic side of life all the time, but I really wasn't prepared. When Gordon Truesdale, a local farmer with a wife and 4 girls, came to my office one day and asked me whether a man might be poisoned from handling a corpse. I was speechless for nearly a minute. What a bizarre question to ask someone, even a doctor, out of the blue. If he were a mortician, it might make more sense. But he was a farmer, a very pale and trembling one, I noted, with a feverish flush on his cheeks and 2 bright eyes. Yes, most definitely, I said belatedly when I'd recovered from my shock. Yes, we just heard that, Meg. Somebody just said that last night, consumption, that it was TB. Yeah, I was just thinking of that. Thank you, Kathy. I'm glad because I really enjoy reading to you guys. I've always loved reading anyway, Thank you. Yes, most definitely, I said belatedly when I recovered from my shock. Oh, Gordon said softly, looking at the floor and losing the remainder of his color. Why do you ask? I queried, staring at him long and hard. No reason, Gordon said hastily, still looking anywhere but me. Just curious. He rose hastily, muttered good day, and rushed from my office. As the door slammed shut behind him, I remembered that Gordon was an amateur phrenologist. Does anybody know what that is? Phrenologist. Phrenologist. And a very bad one. Thank you, Scottish Bluebell. That's so sweet. Thank you so much. You didn't have to do that. But that's really sweet of you. Thank you. You don't know, Mom? I like calling you Mom. He liked to fill the bumps. Oh, that's what it is. He liked to fill the bumps on people's heads to analyze their personalities. I'd once heard him boast about his collection of skulls that he used in his quote unquote research. Had Gordon been digging around in places God had not intended man to delve? The thought disturbed me so much that I went to the pump and washed my hands vigorously before calling in my next patient. The very next person in my office was the wife of the local farrier whom I was treating for a bad tooth. She was a cousin of the late Sarah Platt, and she had a disturbing tale to tell. "I suppose you heard about the scandal, doctor?" She asked me as she trudged in the door. When I replied in the negative, she told me about the jawbone a farmer had found in his field, which was adjacent to the local graveyard. It, it were a human jawbone, the woman said, taking a seat at my gesture. "Turned out to belong to my poor cousin Sarah. Someone dug her up her grave and stole her head. Disgraceful. People have no respect for the dead." Stole her head? My eyes widened in shock, and my thoughts went instantly to the amateur phrenologist who wanted to know if a person could be poisoned by a corpse. As I examined the painful tooth, yeah, it sounds like it, Meg. As I examined the painful tooth, I asked for more details and learned the grave had been disturbed sometime in the last 2 weeks, not long ago then, and now the amateur phrenologist was feverish and appeared ill. 3 days later, Mrs. Truesdale sent her eldest daughter to fetch me. Her husband was seriously they're supposed to be true, but it's spooky Indiana tales of hauntings, strange happening, and other local lore. So, something that was true, but kind of probably blew itself out of proportion. The study of the conformation of the skull is indicative of mental faculties and traits of character. Wow. I'd never heard of that. 3 days later, Mrs. Truesdale sent her eldest daughter to fetch me. Her husband was seriously ill and needed a doctor. I packed my bag, summoned several attendants to aid me in the event surgery was needed, and drove my carriage to the Truesdale farm, wondering what I would find. Gordon, a bed with fever, perhaps? When I entered the bedroom where the stricken man lay, I was not prepared for the sight that met my eyes. Gordon's face was so red and swollen, he no longer resembled a human being. His eyes looked as if they might pop right out of his face, but they were turned so far inward with pain that the whites showed. The area across his nose and forehead seemed to have filled with some kind of liquid substance that wobbled slightly whenever he took a breath, which he could do only through his mouth. His lips were drawn back into a snarl of agony, showing what remained of his yellowing teeth. The smell in the room turned my stomach, and only years of working with the foulest patient conditions kept me calm. Some sort of massive erysipelas, Erysipelas, I thought as I took in his symptoms, though I had never seen a case such as this. Perhaps it was a new sort of disease. Whatever was poisoning his system, the only chance I had of saving his life was to get rid of the substance liquefying his body from underneath his skin. I was glad I'd brought my attendants with me, because it was obvious I had to operate immediately. I sent the poor man's wife away. She was 9 months pregnant with their 5th child, due to give birth any day. I don't know, Meg. They're just short stories. To have a deathly ill husband to tend at the same time was taking a toll on the poor woman, who also had a farm and 4 young daughters to care for. We put the man under with chloroform, perhaps the greatest invention of the century, and I made 2 incisions, one from nose to hairline and the other straight across his forehead, hoping to clear out whatever liquid was building up there before it crushed his brain. Instantly, a vicious, putrescent liquid gushed out of the incisions, filling the room with a smell so foul that several attendants fled the room, and the brave man who remained threw up in the corner several times. I stuck grimly to my task as the horrible liquid poured into the large bowl I held up to Gordon's face. "Hey, Sassy Darcy, beep, beep." An infection of the upper layers of the skin. Yeah, I'm getting that now, Steph. "Get me another bowl," I snapped to my remaining attendant, not wishing any of the liquid to splash on me and thanking God I'd taken the precaution of wearing gloves. Right, Mom, of 2. The swelling in Gordon's face was slowly decreasing as the liquid spewed out, but it was obvious I was going to have to make several more incisions around the man's skull. The attendant brought me a fresh bowl and carried the other bowl out of the house to bury it. When the gush was over, I lightly banged the incisions and shaved the poor man's head. Then I made several more incisions across his skull and went through the same foul process again and again until the patient's head was roughly the same size as formerly. "How can a man live through this?" the attendant murmured. "He can't," I thought. "This is what comes of desecrating the dead." That gave me the chills right there. This is what comes of desecrating the dead. "We've got to clean out the rest of that mess," I said briskly, doing my best to ignore the gruesome nature of the task. I injected water into the incisions on his face, and it squirted right through his skin and burst out of the incisions on the rest of his skull. There was obviously no flesh or muscle left inside his skin, nothing under there but bone. I was amazed he was still breathing. I sewed up Gordon best as I could, and then we cleaned up the befouled bedroom before we brought him around. When his missus had returned to his bedside, I told them both that Gordon would probably not live out the week. "I'm sorry," I said. "We've done everything we could, but the infection has gone too deep. I'll leave an attendant here to help as much as we're able." "Thank you, Doctor," Mrs. Truesdale said bravely. After motioning for the attendant to leave them alone for a few moments, I went out to the yard to divest myself of my fouled clothing. As I washed under the pump, fearing I would never be cleansed of the putrescent liquid that had oozed from Gordon's body, I heard the couple talking through the open window. In a gasping voice, Gordon confessed his crime to his wife. He had indeed dug up the grave of Sarah Platts and stolen her head to aid him in his study of phrenology. He'd tossed away the jawbone on his way home, not needing it for his studies. At the time of the robbery, he had an open wound on his nose, and he'd wiped his face with his corpse-befouled hands, unconsciously infecting himself with the disease that was now racing so fatally through his body. As I straightened up from the pump, soap in hand, I heard Gordon tell his wife that the head was hidden in the barn and should be returned to the Platt family. I bundled my jacket and gloves into a spare blanket and threw them into the back of the carriage. Once home, I burned my clothes along with the blanket. My wife heated water on the stove, and I scrubbed my skin until it was raw to rid myself of any vestiges of that terrible disease. I know. Ugh. Gordon lived, if you could call it that, for 3 more days. I had attendants with him constantly, and I dropped in whenever I could to monitor his condition. Gordon was rotting from the inside out. The swelling returned as various parts of his body turned to ooze underneath his burning skin. His breath grew so foul and hot that it was impossible to wait on him properly. One attendant, whose hand came within 6 inches of the man's mouth during a routine procedure, gave a shriek and leapt away, claiming his skin stung as if he'd fallen in a field of nettles. The odor of decay stayed on the attendant's hand for hours. After that, I ordered anyone attending Mr. Truesdale to wear gloves. Thank you, Kevin. The corrosion of Gordon's flesh continued until his eyes rotted in their sockets and he could no longer see. His skin was so atrophied that a touch would have caused it to fall from his bones. And the smell was so pervasive that I sent the family to a neighbor's house until the house could be fumigated. I'd instructed the attendants to clap the man into a coffin as soon as the end came. I was taking no chances on anyone else catching the disease that had done in Gordon. I wanted him buried as quickly as possible. It seemed sacrilege to treat him so disrespectfully, but what else could I do? There were young children and a pregnant mother living in this house, and I was also responsible for the health of the nursing attendants in my service. As soon as Gordon breathed his last, the attendants picked up the sheet, being loath to touch him, and lowered him into the coffin. Then they nailed it shut and called for a wagon to take them to the cemetery. Everyone involved had prepared for the rapidness of Gordon's burial, and an open grave lay in wait for its new resident. Unbeknownst to the attendants, the corpse was swelling with noxious gases inside its new resting place. As the wagon pulled into the yard, the lid of the coffin blew off, and foul air swept over everyone. Coughing and swearing, the valiant attendants recovered the coffin's lid and strapped it down over the swelling corpse. Then the coffin was loaded into the wagon, which jounced and trounced over the rutted road, heading at speed toward the graveyard. The attendants and mourners had barely reached the cemetery before the lid exploded from the coffin once more. Noxious fumes poured over the assembly, and the corpse swelled visibly before the eyes of the assembled. The corpse was hastily lowered, lidless, into the open grave, and the mourners stepped back as far as they could while the grave was filled in. When the hasty funeral was complete, everyone went home except for the Truesdale, who stayed that night with a neighbor, since the air in their house was unbreathable, even after fumigation. Hi, Josie West. Hi, Tina Bina. Yep, blew off a couple times. Gordon's fifth daughter was born in the neighbor's home the day after her father, the phrenologist turned grave robber, died. I paid Gordon's attendants top dollar for that particular assignment, and I hope to God there were no more grave robbers in town. One case was enough for me. I have to read this. I got to read this one right here. Black Widow, Porte, because we've been there a few times. Okay. It does. That's good, Tina. I'm sure you guys have probably heard of this woman, the Black Widow from Porte, Indiana. I suppose it isn't proper to dislike your neighbors, but I did not care for Widow Sorensen, not one bit. Her name was Belle, which did not suit her at all. She was a plain, heavy-set woman who had immigrated to the United States from Norway. Belle moved into a hog farm near our place in November of 1901, bringing with her three girls, her own two daughters, and a pretty niece named Jenny Olson. Of course, I dropped over with a bit of baking to welcome Belle and the girls to the neighborhood when they first moved in, a standard custom in our community. The widow welcomed me without enthusiasm and offered me a cup of tea. We spoke stiltedly for a polite half hour. She told me she had been married to a Norwegian man in Chicago, and they had owned a confectionery store until it was destroyed by fire 2 years before. Yeah, Belle Gunness. Yep, Belle Gunness. I've heard of, watched things on her. My life has been filled with tragedy, Belle sighed, wiping tearless hard eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief. Belle and her husband had collected insurance on their lost business, which had allowed, yep, which had allowed them to keep their home. They had boarded foster children to supplement their income. Oh, really? A heart made noise. Then my husband, Mads, passed on, a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. I was in shock, Belle said. Fortunately for me and the children, Mads had 2 life insurance policies when he passed, which left us enough money to live on. I felt at the same time that the city was not the place to raise a family, so we traded our property in Chicago for this farm. It is better, I felt, for the girls to live in the country. How did I not know all this happened in LaPorte, supposedly? That's where we used to take our boat, on Pine Lake in LaPorte. She nodded to the silent children, playing listlessly in the corner. I was more than happy to end the conversation when the obligatory 30 minutes had passed. This hard-eyed woman and her spiritless children were not to my taste. Widow Sorensen's feigned grief and all her talk about insurance made me feel dirty. I went right home and heated up water for a bath, even though it was the middle of the week. I wanted the touch of that house off my skin. Belle might not have been to my taste, but she managed to land a husband right quick. Within a few months, she was Mrs. Peter Gunness, and her new man dug in and started running the hog farm for her. They seemed happy together, and the children perked up with his addition to their family. All seemed well at the hog farm, until the day little Jenny Olson, who was close friends with our son, came running into our farmyard, crying bitterly. According to Jenny, her new uncle had been in a terrible accident. She hadn't seen it herself, but her Aunt Belle said that Peter had knocked a pot of boiling water off the stove onto his head and face while bending over to collect his shoes. He'd stood up in a daze of pain, knocking his burnt head against a shelf beside the stove and bringing a sausage grinder down on top of himself. "He's dead," sobbed Jenny, "just like Uncle Mads." I hugged the poor child. What could I say? She'd lost 2 father figures in the last 2 years. My son patted Jenny shyly on the shoulder, comforting her as best as he could. I couldn't help thinking, as I sat the trembling girl down at the table for cookies and milk, that Belle Gunness probably had a new insurance payment coming to her. The thought made my skin crawl, and I pulled my shawl tighter around me. I couldn't believe I'd just had such a terrible thought. But I wasn't the only one suspicious of Peter Gunness's sudden bizarre death. The coroner held an inquest, but the evidence was inconclusive, and the newly widowed Belle Gunness walked free. That day, I told my son that Jenny Olson was welcome at our house, but I didn't want him visiting her at the hog farm. Belle got herself a hired man named Ray Lamphere to help her around the farm. Hi, Lisa. Oh, okay. Yeah. Wait, look and hi, Lisa. Glad you're here. Is it on Netflix? Lisa? Let's see. What was her name? Bailey Saran. Okay. Or Saran. Hi, Peanut Black. Okay, Belle got herself a hired man named Ray Lamphere to help her around the farm and lived quite well off the insurance money for some time. Then I learned from Jenny, who often came to our house to do her homework with my son, that Belle had started putting matrimonial advertisements in the Norwegian newspapers. She wanted another partner to help her run the farm. Auntie is always writing letters in the evening, Jenny said carelessly, taking a large bite of apple pie from the plate I'd laid beside her on the kitchen table. I think she's gotten some responses to her matrimonial advertisements. So it seemed. Over the next few years, a number of men came to visit Belle on the farm. None of them lasted very long. I guess Widow Gunnis was picky about who should share, the sparkling water, about who should share her prosperous farm. We'd seen them squiring Belle around town or driving past our house on their way to visit Belle at her farm. Then a few days would pass and they were gone. Jenny claimed that the hired man, Ray Lamphere, made the suitors nervous. I think he's jealous of Annie's beaus. I think Ray is sweet on her, she told us over dinner one evening. My boy looked up at the word sweet, and he and Jenny smiled at one another. They were sweethearting a bit themselves at the moment. It was an innocent romance. His pa and I made sure of it. But I figured if they still felt the same way next year, then we'd be having a wedding at our place. So I was quite disturbed when my boy came home from school one afternoon, absolutely distraught. Jenny Olson hadn't come to class that day, and her cousin Myrtle said it was because Belle had sent Jenny off to some fancy school in the East. Oh, Bailey Sarian here on YouTube. Okay, thanks, Heart. Oh, she killed the little girl? Widow Gunnis doesn't like me sweethearting Jenny, my son moaned, dropping into a kitchen chair. I know that's why she sent Jenny away. Myrtle said last night Jenny was doing chores and complaining about her schoolwork, and this morning she was gone just like that. Widow Gunnis must have packed her up overnight and put her on the first train out of town. You and Jenny weren't fooling around, were you? I asked sternly, sitting down next to him and taking his chin in my hands. Did you get Jenny in the family way? No, Mama, I swear I didn't, he said earnestly. I knew my son. He was telling the truth. If I had, we would have told you and gotten married right away. You know that. But I never did more than kiss her, Mama. I promise. Well, then, I said, that was that. My son relaxed when he saw I believed him. I'll speak with Widow Gunnis and get Jenny's address. Then you can write to her at her new school, I said firmly. We'll all write to her so she won't be homesick. I did not want to go to Widow Gunnis's hog farm. Every time I visited the place, I walked away with my skin crawling and had to take a bath. Oh, wait, let me show you this illustration. The very air of the hog farm seemed foul, and it wasn't the muddy pigs that made it that way. We had hogs of our own, and they were cleaner than Widow Gunnis, in my opinion. But I'd promised my son, and I was pretty distraught myself over losing the girl I'd pegged as my future daughter in law. Fortunately, I met Widow Gunnis in the market the next day, so I took the opportunity to ask her about Jenny. She told me the same story Myrtle had told my son. She didn't like the education Jenny was getting at the local school and had sent her niece east to get better training. When I told Belle that my family wanted to write to Jenny at her new school, she stuck her nose up in the air. She really did, and said she wanted her niece to meet a better quality of people than those residing in LaPorte, Indiana. Then she walked away, leaving me with my mouth hanging open. Of all the nerve, Belle Gunnis was a money-hungry, man-mad social climber. Gah! Gah! As I stormed home to complain to my husband, I realized that my son was right. Belle really had separated the couple from one another. My husband and I discussed the matter at length, but what could we do? Belle was Jenny's legal guardian. We had no claim on her. My son asked Myrtle and her sister, Lucy, if they could give him Jenny's address, but they didn't have it. Not a soul from home was writing to that poor young woman, unless Belle was sending her letters, which I doubted. Excuse me. Right, Lisa. Yeah. This one actually is a true story. So maybe these other ones are too. Tina, exactly. The kiss comes last. That's right. And then they have the kids and then the wedding 20 years down the road. Times change. Don't worry, son, my husband said. Jenny knows where we live. She'll write to us. But no letter came, and I wondered whether Belle had threatened Jenny in some way to prevent her from contacting us. I wouldn't put it past her. Naturally, no one in my household would associate with the Gunnis family after that. Of course, I heard rumors about Belle. She had another man come to visit her in January, but he disappeared like all the rest. Then she got into some kind of a disagreement with her hired hand and dismissed him. So much for Jenny's sweethearting theory. Or maybe she had been correct. Only the sweethearting had all been on Ray Lamphier's side. According to rumor, Lamphere started harassing Widow Gunnis and threatening her family. Belle lodged a complaint against him with the police, and I guess he backed off some. Not long after that, I saw Belle drive past my house with a strange woman beside her. That was odd. Seen Belle driving around with plenty of men and with her children, but this was the first time seen her driving with an unknown female companion. The woman was small and light and dressed in traveling clothes. She made Belle look wide and ungainly. What a pair, I thought, as I returned to my baking, dismissing the incident from my mind. As usual, though, the sight of Belle made me think of my poor boy. My son had lost a great deal of weight since Jenny's departure more than a year ago. I hadn't realized he'd set his heart on marrying when they were done with school, nor how devastated he'd be when he realized at last that Jenny wasn't going to write to him. My husband and I both told him we thought Belle Gunness had forbidden her niece to communicate with us, but my son was convinced that Jenny would have defied her aunt if she truly cared for him. He hadn't looked at another girl since Jenny left, and he was well on his way to being a cynic about love. I didn't like his attitude much, but how could I blame him? I could and did blame Belle, but I couldn't do anything about that either, except avoid her. I woke a couple of nights later with the smell of smoke coming in the window, which I left cracked open at night to let fresh air into the bedroom. I nudged my husband awake, and we went to the window to peer out. The sky was ablaze, and we realized that Widow Gunness's home was on fire. All grudges went by the wayside in an emergency. The widow and her daughters needed our help, and we would give it to them. We threw on our coats and boots, sent our son to alert the fire brigade, and ran to help in any way we could. By the time we arrived, the ground floor was ablaze, and flames were threatening the roof. No one could go near the roaring inferno, and anyone still inside was already dead. I felt myself shaking in fear for the girls and their mother. A neighbor from an adjoining farm told us that he and the new hired hand had brought a ladder to check the upstairs rooms for Belle and the girls when the fire first broke out, but the upstairs rooms were empty. That was strange. Empty? At this time of night, I gasped. Where did they go? They may have run downstairs trying to get out, he suggested. That seemed as good a theory as any. The firemen flocked to the farm as soon as the alarm was given, but the house was too far gone to save. In the morning, when the fire died down, the firemen had the grim task of finding what remained of the family. A search of the burnt house proved fruitless until the men went into the cellar, where they found four bodies lying on a charred mattress, 3 of them belonging to children and 1 to a woman. Bizarrely, the woman's body had no head. After hearing this, the sheriff decided it was not fire that had killed the victims. It was murder, plain and not so simple. Remembering the complaint, oh, good, paint it black, good. Remembering the complaint brought against Lamphere, the former hired hand was arrested and accused of killing the family and starting the fire. It looked like an open and shut case against him. Then a new player entered the scene. According to the owner of the market, a man named Asa Helgeline was in Porte searching for news about his brother, Andrew, who had disappeared in January after visiting the widow Belle with a large amount of cash in possession. He had been another matrimonial hopeful, and I dimly remembered seeing a man with Widow Gunness around that time. Anyway, Asa had gone to the sheriff and received permission to search the burnt house for some clues as to the whereabouts of his brother. They went to the Gunness place today to look around, but the sheriff didn't find anything, the owner of the market concluded. Asa was pretty disappointed. He came into the market right after the search and told me he's sure Widow Gunness knew something about his brother's whereabouts. Asa wrote to her inquiring after his brother, and he didn't like the tone of her response. He was planning a visit to Porte to follow up with her, but now she's dead, and there's no way of finding out what it was she knew. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. Inside, I shuddered a little. I was sure Asa was right. The hard-eyed widow probably had known where his brother had gone, but I wasn't going to gossip about the poor creature now that she was dead. I still didn't like her or how she treated my son, but the past was the past. I left the store feeling soiled, the way I usually felt when discussing Widow Gunnis. I went home and had a bath. The next day, my husband came home ashen and distraught. I'd been baking all day and hadn't left the farm, so I hadn't heard the news. Early in the day, Asa had returned to the Gunnis farm with a hired hand and a neighbor, and they'd found his brother's neck and arm buried in a rubbish pit. The sheriff had been summoned, and they had started excavating the hole. While they were examining the contents, he'd noticed another soft spot in the earth a few feet away, and they had dug there too. They found Jenny, my husband said, breaking down completely. Jenny was in the second hole. She never left LaPorte. I must have fainted. I don't remember much about the rest of that day, except that the doctor came and gave me a dose of something that tasted terrible and put me to sleep for hours. I don't know how long I was ill. It seemed as if every time I woke up, some new horror had been added to the story. More bodies were found, men mostly, but also the bodies of women and children. Many of the bodies had been dismembered. The sheriff and his men put the remains into the carriage house, which acted as a morgue while the investigation continued. As word spread about the mass grave on the Gunnis farm, sightseers started gathering at the edges of the property. According to my husband, parents were holding up children to the windows of the carriage house to view the grisly remains inside. Ooh, why would you hold your kids up to look in a window to see all that? In Norwegian families who'd lost track of some of their men over the last few years were flocking to LaPorte to see if their loved ones were among the victims. By this time, it was clear that Bell, and not Lamphere, was the perpetrator of the crimes. She lured men to her farm with matrimonial ads. I know, why? Asking them to bring money to invest in the farm, and then she killed them. The police believe she poisoned her victims, and then she and Lamphere would dismember them and bury the body parts around the farm. Folks in town figured that after the widow discharged her hired man, Lamphere threatened to turn Bell in, and she then threatened to implicate him as an accessory to the murders. The sheriff still believed Lamphere had murdered the widow and her children and burned the house, but others were not so sure. The body of the headless woman was much slighter than that of Widow Gunnis, and without the head, it was impossible to identify. When my husband told me that piece of gossip, I was sipping at a bowl of soup. I put my spoon back into the bowl and stared at him in horror, remembering the woman I had seen riding in the carriage with Belle a few days before the fire. I told my husband about the incident, and later I repeated it to the sheriff. I was not happy with the idea that Widow Gunnis might still be alive somewhere. I recovered my health slowly. When I was better, my husband and son took me to visit Jenny's grave. We held a small ceremony for the girl we had all loved, and I put flowers by the marker. To my surprise, my son looked much better than he had all year. He was grave and sad, but he'd regained the lost weight, and the cynical lines around his mouth and eyes were gone. Jenny loved me, he said when I asked him about it. I took his hand and that of my husband, and together we walked out of the cemetery. Lamphere was brought to trial and convicted of arson, but acquitted of murder. The jury did not say who they thought the murderer was,
but they included a statement saying that they believed the woman found in the basement was Belle Gunness. Lamphere was duly sentenced and put into prison, but he died a year later of liver failure. It was rumored that he died believing Belle Gunness was still alive and out there somewhere. Black Widow, stay away from me and mine.
Yeah, she got away with it.
Josie?
Oh, Tina. Ugh. I don't think I can look at that right now or read about that right now. Ugh. I'm going to call it a night. It's morning now, guys, 5 a.m. here. Thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate it. Have a wonderful night, a wonderful day, wherever you are. Okay. Oh, Tina, I think I heard about that on the news. Ice Scottish Bluebell, thank you for that super chat. It was super sweet. Good night, K Bay, Kevin, Lisa H, love you, Boo. Mom, Josie, LMNW50. Yeah, I think I did. Okay, guys. Kevin, love you guys. Bye. Bye, Paint It Black. Thank you.